In today's notes, we're going to talk about research design. So there are different types of research, and the first type that we are going to focus on is an experiment. So the purpose of an experiment is that it's a research method where an investigator manipulates one or more factors or independent variables to observe the effect on some behavior or mental process, which is the dependent variable. By random assignment of participants, the experimenter aims to control other relevant variables. So what does this mean? In the top right corner of your screen, you'll see an image and it says control and experimental. A control group says, I'm going to keep everything exactly the same. For the experimental group, I'm going to change one thing. And that's going to be my independent variable. And I'm hoping that it has an effect on the dependent variable. The idea behind an experiment is if you control and keep everything exactly the same between the two groups and you only change one thing, that one thing will be the reason if there are any differences between the groups. So a strength of an experiment is that it can explain why behavior is occurring. This is the only type of research that can actually use the words cause and effect. The cause of something would be the independent variable, and the effect would be the dependent variable. A weakness of an experiment, though, is that it can be time consuming. It's not always practical in every situation. It's also not always ethical in every situation. Some words to know. Population is all of those in a group being studied, whether humans or animals, from which samples may be drawn. Keep in mind, this does not typically refer to a country's entire population unless it is specifically designed as a national study. Your population, if you are studying students at Thurston High School and the only people that you are choosing from are students at Thurston High School, your population is the students at Thurston High School. You cannot say it's the population of all students in the state of Michigan or all students across the United States. Random assignment says assigning participants to experimental and control groups by chance, thus minimizing pre-existing differences between the groups. So if you are participating in a study, you are randomly assigned to an experimental or control group. You do not get preferential treatment one way or the other. Also, to be selected to be in an experiment, you needed to undergo random selection, and you are now part of a random sample. And the sample should fairly represent a population because every person in that population had an equal chance of being chosen or included in the study. There are 4 big variables in experiments that we need to know. The first is an independent variable. We've talked about this briefly before. This is the experimental factor that's being manipulated. This is the variable whose effect is being studied. We hope that this becomes the cause that we can write about in our conclusion. The dependent variable is the outcome factor, the variable that might change in response to manipulations of the independent variable. We're hoping this becomes the effect that we can write about in our conclusion. Control variables are any other factors that are kept exactly the same throughout the experiment. This could be something as seemingly small as the temperature in a classroom. But control factors have to all be kept as close to normal and exactly the same as possible between the two groups. Confounding variables are what pop up when not everything is controlled for. These are factors that happen that might actually have an effect on the experiment. If you're doing a test in a high school and the fire alarm goes off, that would be a confounding variable. It could have an effect on your results. Depending on the confounding variable and what happens, it can limit the confidence in research conclusions, and more studies will need to be done. So experiments are set up in a very specific way. Not only do you have an experimental and a control group. Remember, the experimental group is getting the treatment. They are getting the independent variable. The control group is not. They are getting, if it's in a drug study, it's something called a placebo, so a fake pill or a fake treatment. If it's not a drug study in a medical environment, they are just getting a normal situation, whatever is being studied at the time. But once participants have been split up into the two groups, the experiment has been designed in one of 2 ways. It is either a double-blind or a single-blind study. It's important to know that the participants are always blind or ignorant to what group they're in. They don't know if they're in the experimental or the control group. However, in a double-blind study, the researchers that are interacting with the participants are also blind or ignorant to who's in what group. And this helps minimize any bias that the researchers might have towards people in one group or the other. This is really common in clinical trials or drug evaluation studies, especially if the person that's interfacing with the participants has built a relationship with those participants. You don't need them to be switching the medication that someone's receiving or treating the patients differently because they are receiving a fake drug or the real drug. A single blind study says that the researchers that are interacting with the participants are aware of who's in what group. Only the participants are blind to what group they're in. One thing about double-blind studies to always keep in mind is that there are extensive lists that are kept. Every participant is given a number or some kind of anonymous code that matches them up. So someone does know who's getting what treatment. They're just not the people that are interacting with the participants. There's someone that's in an office that has very strict logs of who's getting what so that they can actually publish their results. The placebo effect says that experimental results caused by expectations alone constituted something called a placebo effect. So what that means is if you were trying a new drug treatment and you thought that just by taking the drug you already felt better, even if you had the fake drug, if you said, "Oh, I already feel better, it's definitely working," that's a placebo effect. You may just be taking a sugar pill. It may have zero effect on you whatsoever, but because you feel like you are taking something else, you kind of start to tell yourself that you're starting to feel better. You're starting to see results. Operational definitions. These are really important in an experiment. They describe exactly what's being studied with very precise procedures and measurements so that anyone can replicate the experiment. You want to make sure that if you are designing an experiment, that once you've published your results, someone else can redo them and someone else can redo your experiment to confirm what you've already found. So you need to make sure you're exceptionally clear with how you define what you're measuring, how you define what you've changed, and you're very clear with which variables you're controlling and how. So operational definitions are very carefully worded. So for example, if you're measuring happiness, you would say, in a study, an operational definition of happiness may be counting the number of times a person smiles every minute. This provides specific measurements and instructions so that someone can reproduce the study and hopefully get similar results. Someone else could define happiness as something different. So you have to be very specific with how you're defining it so that someone else could replicate it. So for an example, do students learn better online or in person? So the independent variable for this experiment would be how students are learning. Are they learning online or are they learning in person? The dependent variable would be how much students are learning. So the researcher is going to need to determine an operational definition for this. How are they going to measure learning? If it's an end of the unit test, what specific score do students need to earn to show mastery? Control variables, you'll want to control the teacher, make sure that's the same. The content, the activities, everything must be exactly the same for whether students are learning in person or online. You only want the variable of how they are learning to change. Confounding variables here, thinking about, does a student have access to family members that can help them at home? Does a student have transportation issues that prevent them from getting to school on time? Are there other stressors outside of school that impact a student's ability to learn? The next type of study we're going to talk about are correlational studies. And so the purpose of a correlational study is it's a measure of the extent to which two variables change together. So how well each variable can predict the other. Please keep in mind, correlations indicate the possibility of a cause and effect relationship, but they cannot and they do not prove that one is out there. They just show that a relationship exists. Correlation does not equal causation. When we notice random coincidences, we sometimes forget that they're random and we see them as possible correlations instead. So, this is actually something that can drive superstitions. Correlations are always shown on a scatter plot. All of the results are shown as little points. And so, there's something called a correlation coefficient, which is a very fancy word for the slope or the line of best fit. This measures the strength of a relationship. It goes from -1 to +1, no more, no less. A positive correlation says that as one variable increases, the other one increases. A negative correlation, or an inverse, says that as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. No correlation says that there's no relationship. The dots are all over the place. So scatter plots help us visualize correlations. Positive correlations are also called direct correlations or positive slope. Negative correlations are also called inverse correlations, or the line would have negative slope. Things to remember: the positive and negative signs do not determine the strength of a correlation. Plus does not mean good, negative does not mean bad. The strength of the correlation, if it's a really strong positive correlation, it's going to be really close to the whole number, +1. If it's a really weak positive correlation, it's going to be a decimal that's closer to 0 than it is to 1. An illusory correlation is a fake correlation. It's when we believe that there's a relationship between two things, and we're more likely to notice and recall instances that confirm our beliefs. This is often influenced by something called confirmation bias. And we'll talk more about this in social psychology. But this is when we look for people or ideas that agree with us, and we dismiss people or ideas that are different from us. Another type of research is survey research. So the purpose of survey research is a technique for obtaining the self-reported attitudes or behaviors of a particular group, usually by questioning a representative random sample of a group. So a strength of a survey would be that it's quick and relatively inexpensive to gather a lot of data from a lot of people very quickly. There's some weaknesses. The wording of the questions can influence the answers. And when people have to self-report, it actually can skew the results. People generally want to appear better than they actually are, even if they're told their results are anonymous. This also can't explain why behavior is occurring. It can just identify that it's there. So survey questions typically have these strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree kind of statements. The United States Census is an example of a survey. I also have naturalistic observations. The purpose of these is to observe and record behavior in naturally occurring situations without trying to manipulate and control the situation. So you're just watching. Naturalistic observations can help to avoid the observer effect, where some people, if they feel like they're being watched, are automatically going to act differently. Weaknesses, though, is that the variables being measured can be altered just by the act of being measured. This is called the Hawthorne effect. Can't necessarily explain why the behavior is occurring. So the Hawthorne effect, we will watch a video for this in class, but it's a pretty fascinating experiment about how lighting actually affected workers' productivity. Another type of research is a case study. The purpose of this is a very in-depth look at a very specific person or situation. So some strengths is that it can give us a lot of information on one specific person or situation, and it can generate a lot of potential research questions for the future. But a weakness is it also cannot explain why behavior is occurring, and you can't generalize these ideas to the entire population because you've done such an in-depth look at one specific situation. The results can also mislead us if the person being studied is atypical. Another type is a longitudinal study. The purpose of this is that it's a research design that involves repeated observations of the same variables, so people, over short or long periods of time. So a strength is that it gives very accurate information on the long-term effects of a variable. So studying vaccine effects over time with the same people, just as time elapses. It can help us understand environmental factors, the effects of screen time, etc. But a weakness is it takes a long time, and so we don't get a lot of results until close to the end of someone's lifetime or the end of the study. A cross-sectional study. This uses different groups of people who differ in the variable of interest but share other characteristics such as socioeconomic status, educational background, and ethnicity. It's often used by researchers studying developmental psychology. So, positive of this is that it's quick, easy, and inexpensive. It can provide future research questions and provides overall trends of the population as a whole. Weaknesses, though, is that it can't provide a lot of in-depth information about one group of people, and it does not determine cause and effect. So the picture up here in the top right says it takes place at a single point in time, does not involve manipulating variables, considers several characteristics at once, and it analyzes the prevailing characteristics in a given population. So research design matters. The way a study is designed determines what type of conclusions we can draw from it. Do you want to know cause and effect? You need an experiment with random assignment. Do you want to reduce the possibility for alternative explanations? You need an experiment. Experiments are the most specific and the most controlled, but they are also the most expensive and time-consuming. If you want to see if two variables are just related, but you don't care about cause and effect, a correlational study would be perfect. Do you want to know the general trends of a large group of people? That would be a survey. Do you want to know very specific, detailed information about one person and you don't need to apply it to anyone else? That's a case study. Do you want to see people in their natural environment? That's a naturalistic observation.